Well, it's a pleasure to be back here with you, Warren, and I'll introduce you again, even though I just introduced you, but there's so much I could say about you that I can always come up with something new. So as I mentioned before, you've been a pioneer and involved in both the women's and men's movement. And you were an early leader in the men's movement called by GQ as the Martin Luther King of the men's movement. And more recently, your book, which this session is kind of based on, is The Boy Crisis, which highlights the challenges that many of our younger boys face in terms of mental and physical health, as well as education. So in this session, we will be following Warren, and I understand you will be doing interactive experiential exercises that will outline some of the causes of this crisis and what we might do to address it, which I think is a crucial thing for these boys that are being raised, that someday are going to become men. And if they're not healed, as one of our speakers says, hurt men hurt other people.
Yeah.
So anyway, without further ado, I'll turn it to you, Warren.
Absolutely. As Yossi was sort of implying, I started getting involved in this area when I was doing work in the women's movement and speaking around the world. And one of the first books I wrote, Why Men Are the Way They Are. And I remember a Japanese woman coming up to me when I was touring a tour in Japan and saying, in my classroom, boys are having more problems than the girls. Then I heard this on a Canadian tour, an Australian tour, and my sister mentioned some of the problems that some of the boys in her class were having. She's a teacher, and some of the girls too, but mostly the boys. And so I started putting boys' issues on my radar, but what I was making my living from was speaking around the world on women's issues and was sort of being paid to tune into that. But I did begin to register on my agenda, and I then began to see in the 70s that there was early research showing that children that were raised not in divorce situations or with minimal father involvement, that they were having significant problems, both girls and boys, but especially the boys. And so I started to say, well, I am speaking on these issues on women's behalf, but I always believe that we're all part of the same family boat, and if only one sex wins, both sexes lose. So I started living up to my own belief system and starting to be more open to not just being the biggest hero in the women's sensitivity world, but also trying to be open to the challenges and that both sexes were dealing with. And so as I started to look at boys' issues and men's issues, I began to see that men were doing really badly in so many areas. And so one of those areas, for example, was mental health. And I saw that when boys and girls were 9 years of age, they rarely committed suicide. And when they did, they committed it equally. But between the ages of 10 and 14, boys were committing suicide at twice the amount of girls. Between the ages of 15 and 19, boys were committing suicide at 4 times the amount of girls. And between the ages of 20 and 24, boys were committing suicide at 5 times the amount of girls. So I noticed that, and I also noticed I had run for governor of California in 2003 against Schwarzenegger, who outmuscled me. And I was speaking at different prisons at that point. And I started to ask in one prison, how many of you were brought up with minimal or no father involvement, what I would call dad-deprived boys. And the first prison I went to, almost 95% of the prisoners raised their hand, but nobody had ever articulated that, and the prisoners themselves didn't even see that commonality among them. And I started to share what dads did that led to boys doing so much better when they were raised by biological fathers. And I remember after my first presentation, a bunch of the prisoners were allowed to come up to me, and one of them just sort of was waiting behind, And I could see he had tears in his eyes. And this guy, had muscles like I'll never have, and tattoos and so on. And he says, doctor, sir, until you gave your speech on the value of dads, I really felt that I was worthless and that I was in here, and probably stay in here for my lifetime was probably what was best for society and for my family. But when I started to see all the things that I used to do with my kids and what the value of them was that I never appreciated, I really have an inspiration now to get out of prison as quickly as I can, to help my children not make the mistakes that I've made and to give them a good fathering as well. And so I began to start seeing that part of here I was observing a mental health problem. As some of you may know, the prison population in California alone, in the United States, has increased 700% since the 1970s. And in California, we've created since the 1980s 24 new prisons and 4 new universities. So it gives you some sense as to them. And those are basically, prisons are basically men's centers. About 90% of the prisoners are males. And so that's the mental health issue. Physical health issue, I was quite surprised that before COVID, because it's not really fair to look at COVID, but before COVID, there were, for the first time in history, that was not dependent on a war, males, a group of people, a gender, died sooner than they had in the past year for 3 consecutive years in a row. And that was men that died sooner than they at an earlier period in life than they had done the year before. Whereas life expectancy normally goes up from each year. And it had never gone down for either gender for 3 years in a row, except for men during a wartime. And so that sort of struck me about physical health. I also saw that physical health wise in 1920, the life expectancy gap between males and females was only 1 year. Women lived 1 year longer than men. Today, the life expectancy gap between males and females is 5.3 years. I began to see that the sperm counts were different. The sperm counts of males have decreased 60% since the 1980s, 60%. And that means that the children are likely to be less fertile, less healthy, and that's going to apply to female children as well as male children, having less of that healthiness. And it's a good example of the way that men's issues are women's issues. Obviously, we don't want our daughters to be less healthy than they were when the sperm counts of men were higher. And it's one of the reasons why we're all in the same family boat. When only one sex wins, both sexes lose. And so I started beginning to see these differences in physical health issues as well. I also looked at education, and some of us already know that that women now are much more likely. It used to be that men were much more likely they were about 60% of the people that went to college, and women were about 40%, and now it's basically reversed. However, what you don't hear is that men, once they're admitted to college, are 10% or more, they're 10% less likely to graduate from college than women are once both sexes are admitted to college. And so the prediction is that in about 4 or 5 years, the projection is that there'll be about twice as many female graduates from college as there will be male graduates. And if we think about the implications of that, again, for both sexes, not just males, is think about a woman who's a college graduate wanting to go around and find a future husband who is worthy of her and who will be a good role model for their son or daughter. And and she's now faced with a world where as a college graduate, she has only half as many males graduating from college. So a college graduate is in many cases looking around for a dropout. Males today are 66% more likely, 66% of the people living back with their families after they graduate from high school or college or drop out of high school or college. 66% between the ages of 25 and 31, 6% are males. There are much more males who drop out of high school have a 20% plus unemployment rate in their 20s. And so can you imagine this woman going around with a sign saying, looking for a future husband to be a great father, and searching through unemployment lines, and then searching in different parents' basements and saying, looking for a dropout, please, looking for a future dad. Most women don't, women who marry tend to marry men who earn about as much or more than they do and seek those men out. They don't tend to seek out men who are living in parents' basements or on unemployment lines. And so this men's issue of less education is also a women's issue. And then there's IQs. The IQs usually, each generation normally has about a 10% increase in IQs. So since the 1980s, that would be almost a 20% increase in the two generations since the 1980s in IQs that would be expected. However, instead of men's IQs going up 20 points in two generations, men's IQs in the last two generations have gone down 15 points. So if you add those two together, there's a cumulative loss of IQs among males of about 35 IQ points since the 1980s, over what would be expected. And so I then asked myself, okay, what's the cause here? And when I submitted my boy crisis book to the publisher a number of years ago, I outlined about a dozen different possible causes for me to explore. And I did explore all those causes. And let me just take a drink of water here. And because we have a limited amount of time and I want to get it to some experiential work, I'm going to focus only on the cause that was the most important of the 10 or 12 causes that I investigated. And that was, I found that more than in any one area, the boy crisis resides where dads do not reside. I started seeing that dads didn't reside as much with families as they used to, for two reasons. One is divorce, and the other one was single moms. And the reason for that increasing is that boys are falling behind girls in all 57 of the largest developed nations. And you might hear 57 nations as the key words there, but actually the key word is developed. In developed nations, there were enough people who were able to be free from the need to survive, to be able to, for the government and for the society to give both legal permission and social permission for people to have the freedom to divorce that they didn't feel that they could permit before. And women prior to these nations becoming developed, they all put pressure on each other, and everybody put pressure. The church put pressure on women and to make sure that they had children with a husband and were married, even if they were not happy in the marriage. That was not considered the primary issue. The primary issue was the need to survive. And so, but when they became developed nations, there was a decrease in the amount of social pressure that women and men felt to have to stay to have children only when the woman was married. And so today we have in the United States, we have 41% of the children who are born to mothers who are not married to men. Now, some of those mothers are living with men, but the average mother who lives with a man who has a child, that relationship only lasts 3.5 years, as opposed to being married to the man, in which the relationship lasts considerably longer. Secondly, in the divorce situation, when there are divorces, a huge number of those lead to the children being raised predominantly by the mom, oftentimes dad having what's called visitation, seeing the child every other week, and maybe one day during the week. And we find out that those children of divorce who are what I call dad deprived because they're seeing their dad only once every other week, often experience themselves as being abandoned by their father, but they also don't learn a lot of, they don't get the experience of a great many things that dads contribute to the family. Things like roughhousing, things like teasing, things like immersing themselves in nature, things like risk-taking and knowing what risks are proper to take and what things aren't proper to take. They don't learn the ability as much to be assertive versus aggressive. They're much less likely to be empathetic. So there's a huge number of things that the great majority of men and women have no idea that dads contribute that lead to children who are dad deprived being in fact more deprived, both among children of divorce and then also among children who are born to with single moms and raised predominantly by single moms. This is true, by the way, for both sexes. Both girls and boys do considerably worse when they don't have both parents involved in their upbringing in an involved way. But the amount of challenges that the boys have are greater than the amount of challenges that the girls have. And in part because the girls have a same-sex role model and girls are given more permission to share what their problems are. And moms are more likely to identify with the girls' problems, whether it's menstruation or whatever, than a boy feels comfortable talking with his mom about masturbating and why he's doing it, why he's, so on. And so girls and boys both suffer considerably when they are dad deprived in more than 50 different metrics. And if you take those metrics to a more specific way, it's more than 70 different metrics, all of which I document in the Boy Crisis book and explain, the degree to which that deprivation is experienced. So, for example, the single biggest predictor of boys committing the suicide that I talked about before is dad deprivation. One of the single biggest contributors to boys becoming addicted to video games is that dad deprivation. And so what's so important is to understand what is missed when a dad is missing. And I'll just, because of time, and I want to do something experiential again, I'll just give one example of that. Here's a very typical, not atypical, at least male-female dynamic. An involved dad will tend to say something like, let's say there's two sons and a daughter, and he's likely to say something like, okay, it's time for roughhousing. You guys have done your homework and you got everything done that you needed to do chores wise. So you get roughhousing time, and the kids go, really, yeah, they're so excited. And the dad might articulate the game. Okay, the three of you, I'll dump you on the couch here. Your job is to jump off the couch onto my back and pin me down before I pin all three of you down at the same time. All right, Dad, all right, we'll do it, we'll beat you. And the kids jump on, getting ready to jump on the back, and the mom is looking on and feeling, oh my God, I feel like I have only one more child to monitor here. And she's saying, but I don't want to be interfering, and I don't want to be controlling. And yet at the same time, I feel like sooner or later, somebody's going to get hurt. And I'm going to feel really badly if somebody does. And she's only about 99% likely to be right. Sooner or later, somebody gets hurt, and mom feels, oh my God, I feel so guilty. I didn't pay attention to my intuition and get involved and interfere and prevent this from happening to begin with. Why didn't I do that? On the other hand, at least, somebody did get hurt. At least now Dad will get it and understand and stop doing this roughhousing. But Dad doesn't stop doing the roughhousing. He says something like, Jimmy, it's okay to play, with all your heart in the roughhousing and try to pin me down before I pin you down. But it's not okay to stick your elbow in your sister's eye like you just did. And if you do that again, we'll have to stop the roughhousing. And the mother's hearing, wait a minute, do that again? Does that mean you're going to continue the roughhousing? Did you not see that the prediction that I had in the back of my mind that somebody's going to get hurt is actually happened? Then you're not paying attention to that? Well, sure enough, dad can, the kids swear that they won't do it again. And they go back to roughhousing. And so this time, maybe Jimmy doesn't stick his elbow exactly in his sister's eye, but he pushes his brother or sister aggressively out of the roughhousing so that he can be the dominant pinner downer. Kingpinner. And so and so once again, somebody gets hurt. And now dad says, okay, I warned you that if you were too aggressive like that, you would you would not have any more roughhousing tonight. And mom hears, oh, great, dad's got it. Wait a minute. Did I hear the word tonight? Does that mean he's implying that there's going to be more roughhousing in the future, even though twice in a row within a period of hours or minutes, the kids were hurt? And so sure enough, dad says, if you guys are really good, next time we'll do the roughhousing again, but you got to be, pay attention to what I said. So this time the dad starts roughhousing again with the children, and makes the same warnings about if you do it again, we'll stop the roughhousing. Now the children know that if they don't pay attention to their sisters or brothers' needs, as in beginning to be empathetic to what they need or want, or if they're too aggressive versus assertive, and if they don't have the postponed gratification, even though they want to push their brother and sister aside to win, that if they really want the roughhousing to continue, that they need to not do what is immediately gratifying, push their brother and sister aside in order to get postponed gratification, that they've got to pay attention to dad. Why? Because dad used something called boundary enforcement. The last time he roughhoused with them and they did it improperly, he didn't repeat the boundary setting of you can't do that, or else we'll stop roughhousing. He actually stopped the roughhousing. And in that scenario lies so many of the contributions that dad-style parenting so frequently makes. The contribution of requiring the children to think about their sisters and brothers' needs. So the data on roughhousing is that children who roughhouse, who experience roughhousing from their dad or their mom, but 90% of the time is their dad, are more likely to think about, they're more likely to be empathetic because they've been required to see it as a positive for themselves. In the long run, they get what they want when they think of their sisters and brothers' needs. Secondly, they're much more likely to have postponed gratification. They wanted to just push their brother or sister aside, but they wanted the roughhousing even more, so they learned to postpone their gratification in order to get what they really wanted, roughhousing. Postponed gratification is the single biggest predictor of success or failure in life. And so that's complex and it goes many places, but but the many places that it goes are the people with postponed gratification are not only more likely to succeed, but they're a lot less likely to be depressed, suicidal, and antisocial. And so all these things are being learned. The children are learning the difference between being assertive versus aggressive. And of course, that knowing that difference and those fine lines are very crucial to developing friends in schools, and developing friends in school are crucial to feeling that you have an inspiration in order to be able to succeed and do well and do your homework, et cetera, in order to be liked and admired by the friends and teachers and your own parents who will be more likely to admire you. And so that's just one of the areas that dad-style parenting tends to contribute differently than mom-style parenting. What I discovered in doing the research for the boy crisis is that the children who do best are ones that actually have dad-style and mom-style parenting, and the parents communicate effectively enough to have what I call checks and balance parenting. So, for example, the mom might say, the child might ask, can I climb, Mom, can I climb the tree in the backyard? And the mom might say something like, oh, sweetie, maybe in a couple of years, but that's a big tree and you could fall and hurt yourself and even get a concussion and get even killed at worst. And the child might run to dad and say, Dad, can I climb the tree in the backyard? And dad will say, well, yes, but that's a big tree, so be careful. And so the child starts climbing the tree, and mom goes, wait a minute, I just told the child that, you know, she or he could not climb the tree. And so checks and balance parenting might look something like, all right, the dad having enough knowledge to know that when children climb trees, they're able to make and develop an increased assessment of what risks are safe and what risks aren't. Children that climb trees actually increase their IQ. I don't blame moms for not knowing this, because I've never heard dads say this to a mom, and moms can't hear what dads don't say, and dads can't say what they don't read in parenting books or in magazines. And this was not in any parenting book or magazine that I ever read, which is why I felt it was important for the Boy Crisis book to have that in it. And so the parents with checks and balance parenting might be something like the mom and dad negotiating and saying, okay, the child can climb that tree, but not past a certain point, and not on these branches, which are too thin. And dad, the child can only climb the tree if you're out under that tree all the time. So in case our child falls, she or he will be cushioned by your fall. And you often get, you know, caught up in the in your iPhone. So give me the iPhone, and go without the iPhone under the tree. Pay attention to our child, make sure they don't climb up too high, etc. And then the child can climb the tree. So what does the child get? The best of both worlds: some risk taking, some IQ improvement, and some protection from catastrophe. That's an example of checks and balance parenting. So I wanted to do something experientially with you. So I'm going to stop here as that's just a couple of examples of the value of dad style parenting, and especially when combined with mom style parenting, and why children who do best have both parenting styles, and both, unfortunately, I would like to say differently, both biological parents in the home with them. I would like to say step parents or surrogate parents are just as effective. They can be almost as effective, but very rarely are they equally as effective. But those are for much deeper psychological reasons that I can get to in the Boy Crisis book, but not in a short talk. Okay, so let me ask you to do something that that will require, or ask you to request that you just close your eyes for a moment and just relax your body and do a little bit of meditation. I'm going to ask you to make believe you knew or imagined what created the glint in your father's eye when he was younger. Imagine just your dad, whether maybe he loved to tell stories, and he knew that every time he told a story, he would get laughter and approval from people for the certain stories that he told. And you maybe were rolling your eyes as you heard that story many times, but your dad really liked the outcome of that laughter, that approval, that people thinking he was funny. Maybe that created the glint in his eye. Maybe he sang in a chorus and he loved singing. Maybe you saw the glint in your dad's eye. When I say the glint in your dad's eye, what I mean is your dad not feeling like he was looking at you, needing to lecture you, correct you, discipline you, but just complete relaxed joy and happiness. Maybe he had that when he was playing golf. Maybe when he was fly fishing. Maybe he had a small plane and he took that out into the sky at sunset and just watched the clouds and the sunset interact like poetry. And he loved taking you and mom out in that small plane. Maybe he just went to the garage and made little things that he liked to make, usually something useful maybe for the house, and then came back in with some pride in his eyes. Maybe you're a little bit older and the happiest you've ever seen your dad was when he was roughhousing with your children, or playing with your children, or teasing your kids, or laughing with your kids. Maybe it was when your dad came back from church and felt really in peace, or in prayer. Maybe it was he did a piece of some art when he was younger and you discovered it in the attic and you saw your dad just talk with a glint in his eye as he was talking about the days when he did art, or the days when he acted in a school play. Maybe you saw a picture of him in a school play when he was in high school. Maybe you saw an album of your mother and dad when they were on their honeymoon, and your dad looked so much in love and just completely relaxed. So I'm asking you to find that glint in your dad's eye, but maybe you didn't know your dad. Maybe your dad left or died when you were very young. And if that was the case, I'm going to ask you to pick up any hints or what's in your imagination about what might be the glint in your dad's eye, or might have been. Almost everybody has a little sense of that if they allow themselves to dig deeply into what might have been that glint. And even if you don't know it for sure, and you probably don't know the glint in your dad's eye, but even if you don't know it, I'll ask you to do a best guess about what might have been that glint. The best guess I'm asking you to do because that is your relationship with your dad. It includes whatever image you have of him. So I ask you just give some thought about searching through many options. Maybe your dad loved to sing. Maybe your dad loved to write. Maybe your dad wrote poems to your mom. Okay. Hopefully you've identified one or more glints in your dad's eye, or possibilities at least. And now I'm going to ask you to think about what your dad actually did for a living. How did he most of the time, earn enough to support the family to the degree that he supported the family? Or maybe he ran away from, got divorced and didn't pay any child support and didn't support the family economically in any way. Maybe he was an alcoholic. But if he was any of those non-supporters of the family, go into a deeper level of imagination of what your dad thought he would have needed to do, or he have been a responsible contributor to the providing of money for your family, and how that might have felt to him and why he withdrew from it or got drunk from the experience of it, rather than talk about what he really felt. Now I'm going to ask you to go deeper and to think about the actual number of children your family had, your brothers and sisters, and to imagine your dad and mom having a discussion before they had the first child in your family, and correctly imagining how many children they were going to have. And let's say it's 3 or 4 or 2 children. And imagine them sitting down together that may or may not have actually done this, and thinking, if your dad pursued his fantasy, that is, if he just painted, if he just acted, if he just sang, if he just was in a band, if he just told stories, if he just played around with the children full time, would your family have enough money to be able to move into a home in a neighborhood that had good schools and afford paying the mortgage, and afford paying multiple types of insurance, having money in case there's family emergencies, having money to be able to eat well, do things that you wanted to do, eventually send one of the children or all the children to college if need be or desired. Imagine whether what created the glint in your dad's eye was something that your parents would have seen as being practical for your dad to actually do full time. If you're saying my dad, loved to cooked a great turkey on Thanksgiving, and I saw, the turkey on Thanksgiving was just, when he cooked it, created a glint in his eye. And then you say, well, yes, my dad was a chef, so he did what created the glint in his eye. But as you know, when he cooks on Thanksgiving, it's once a year or once an occasion when he wants to do that. And he's cooking for his family. When he's a chef, he's away from his family while he's cooking for strangers. He's doing it every day, all the time, or many days a week, all the time, on a schedule that he's committed to. So it's not really anymore the glint in his eye. So don't mistake a glint in his eye for something related to the glint in his eye that requires systematic focus on the one thing that makes money. So now I'm going to be asking you to open your eyes and to share with the group the gap between what your dad did for a living and what you were able to identify as the glint in his eye. So I'm open to anybody speaking up about that.
I'll go.
Yes, Reginald.
The warm and ironic thing about your examples is that my dad was actually very much the opposite of your status quo. He was very emotionally expressive, kind of turbulent. I mean, he was diagnosed as like manic or bipolar, I guess you could say, at nearing the end of my parents' relationship. But pretty much all things creative were the things that really put a glint in my dad's eye. And then even being at home and playing with us kids and stuff. So, I mean, in many respects, I had like a really strong example of a masculine father figure who is very much in his feminine, like a lot of the time, which is pretty rare. But consequentially, because of him being that way at the time, there was a lot of like alienation, and like it was hard for him to make friends. It was hard for him to hold a job down because he tried starting a painting business and that didn't work out. And he just couldn't find a place in the world because he was very much in his feminine. Yeah. So, he's passed away now as of like 6 years ago or so. But that was something that like he passed on to me that I really have honed and embraced, because it's like preparation for this new discussion that's happening now, where like men do need to be more present and more in their feminine in how they express the solutions to these male issues moving forward. And I'll be honest, Mr. Dr. Farrell, when I first heard of your work and started watching you, I was kind of like, I don't know if he has a sense of urgency in the way that he delivers his message, because like the numbers and the data that you're putting out are incredible, like alarmingly incredible. But then on the flip side of that, you're seeing other guys who are heavy in their masculine putting out the same message, and they're getting followers and stuff, but then it ends up not being effective either. So finding like, I've come back now full circle, and I'm like, holy smokes, maybe he was so ahead of the curve. And, and I think, yeah.
That's what my wife is always saying. She's reading the papers and saying, look at this. You were saying this 30 years ago when I first met you.
Yeah, it's like prophecy.
She gets very frustrated about that. But thank you. That's really a beautiful share. And it really does express so very well the tension between, here's a man that your dad was ahead of his time and being able to be able to not just repress, but express some of these sort of feelings and things that we call feminine, the feminine side of himself, or the internal feminine, and he didn't have the privilege in this society to feel comfortable doing this. And obviously painting was not exactly a manifestation of the things that really seemed to motivate him and create the glint in his eye. So thank you very much for sharing that, Reginald.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? I think I see Ralph.
I got it. Okay, I'm unmuted now, I think. Your question was very interesting to me because I never saw a glint in my father's eye, but there was one thing that he once reported to me where I think he did have a glint. He was orphaned early, and he mentioned that when he was in his 20s, which was indeed in the 1920s, that he pursued and proposed to a young woman who was apparently attractive and adventuresome. And she declined his proposal because she said she wanted to, I have to go back a step and say that they were living in the Boston area. She said she wanted to go out to the Wild West and have a more adventuresome life. And so he married a different hometown girl and lived a very respectable and financially successful life. And as I say, I never saw a glint in his eye. From a contemporary perspective, you might say he needed attachment repair, and he didn't know how to do that, and it was not available. What was known at the time when I was a kid, and he was in his 30s, let's say, what he knew about and what we knew about psychotherapy was exemplified by the movie The Snake Pit, and the title exemplifies very well what the spirit of it was. And the other thing that exemplified it was the local mental institution, and the picture there was of people in what do you call those?
Straitjackets.
The straitjackets, yes.
Yes, so thank you so much. That's very deeply sad and also very deeply, unfortunately, typical. And the straitjacket is a really good metaphor for the whole masculine experience. And what we're talking about here is, when we hear people talk about male privilege would be able to be in touch with the glint in your eye, to be able to live a higher percentage of one's life manifesting that glint. And feeling and being able to achieve the respect of others, but as we do manifest that glint. And so that's not under, so that's part of what we're experiencing, I think, right here. And thank you so much for your contribution, Ralph, on that. Somebody else like to add?
I would love to share a little bit about my dad.
Yes.
I think that I actually share a really similar experience to Reginald in that my dad has always been very emotionally tuned with me and my sister. And honestly, I think in some aspects he followed that glint in his eye, and in others, I don't think that he could. So he has always loved cars and loved planes. And as a kid, he always wanted to be a pilot. So I can just, even now, if I'm standing with him outside and he hears a plane, he can look up and he knows exactly what plane it is. He knows the model, the year it's been made, any of that. Mm-hmm. And so he always wanted to be a pilot. But he and the rest of my family are born with really poor eyesight. And so was never able to do that. So he pursued the car stuff, and he does a lot of artwork, which when we were talking about some of that, I was picturing some of his drawings. But so he actually went on to develop certain patents and designs for cars as well. working for Johnson Controls for a very long time.
Working for what?
Johnson Controls.
Mhm.
So he's got a couple of patents for like sunroof things or a cup holder, things like that.
Yes.
And I don't know, it just made me really happy to see that he's happy.
So do you sense that he is happy now? Is he still alive?
Yes, he is. He actually just retired.
Oh, great. Great.
And yes, I think so. It's funny because he always told me and my sister growing up that out of the two of them, he never really pictured having kids and didn't want them.
Mhm,
And it was my mom that really wanted the kids.
mhm.
But he says over and over that like he can't imagine how lonely that would have been for him
With that.
and how much of a life-changing experience having kids was, and
Yes,
you know, and how much pride we give him. So
absolutely.
yeah.
The qualities that what one has to do to support children so frequently moves men into jobs where they don't feel the manifestation of the glint in their eyes, even if they're doing something that's related to what their passion or their glint is. Like, you know, flying a small plane is very different than, you know, flying a major plane, following FAA regulations, going over places you've seen again and again, following all the discipline of a certain route, et cetera. Than just flying a small plane at sunset and watching the poetry of the clouds and the sun interact differently. But it's very rare for the man to sort of be able to make a living doing the things that really create the underlying glint in his eye. And hopefully now that he's retired, he'll be able to pursue that to a greater degree. But really where I wanted to go there is that, but when the children, when he raises children, oftentimes while that may take him away from the glint in his eye, it replaces it with a glint in his eye. The enormous amount of happiness and satisfaction when children grow up well, and they're not condemning their father or for being who he is oftentimes of enormous reward to a dad, and it creates, in a sense, a new glint that he never would have thought of to begin with.
Yeah, and I've definitely that inspired me in my own work. I actually just finished my master's, and my whole thesis was on custody policies that are kind of already rigged against fathers in order to have custody. So just from my own experience, my parents divorced when I was 2. And I had that very similar experience where I would see my dad Wednesdays and every other weekend only.
Yes.
But I always felt much more connected to my dad. So it was a rough period.
One of the really contributions you can potentially make, Natalie, in your life is to get involved with helping that issue out. The National Parents Organization is very much focused on helping to create equal shared parenting as a starting assumption after a divorce. And that we have enormous amounts of data now to show that children who have an equal amount of time with both mother and father do considerably better than children that have the type of split that you were just talking about, most of the time with one parent, usually the mom, and only every other weekend with the dad, and a day in between. It requires, the closer one gets to 50-50 parenting after divorce. So I'll just be a little bit more specific about this. If you're a product of divorce, you know somebody who's divorced and they're deciding what to do. In the boy crisis, I discussed the 4 must-dos of divorce after divorce if you want your children to have as almost as good a chance of doing well as they would in an intact family. One is an equal amount of time with both mother and dad. Number 2 is that the dad and mom do not live more than about 20 minutes drive time from each other, so that the children don't resent the parent that they're going to because they're missing their soccer game or their best friend's birthday party. Number 3 is that the children don't overhear any bad mouthing from mother about father, or from father about mother. And number 4 is that the parents are involved in consistent couples communication counseling. not just emergency counseling. And when the children have all 4 of those things, they tend to do reasonably well to very well after divorce. And so, but your contribution to the effort that is right on the cusp of being able to be achieved in many states these days of equal shared parenting would be something that really would be a very major contribution for in the next 10 years.
Yeah, and I think I presented that work, at least what I was doing a little bit, to the National Council of Family Relations as well. So I definitely continue planning on doing the work because I do find it very interesting.
Terrific. Very good. Anybody else have a glint in the eye versus what your dad actually did? And then I'll move to some closing comments.
I'll share. Hi.
Hi, Beth, how are you?
Nice to see you again. For others, I got a chance to actually do that exercise years ago in Toronto, actually. So it was interesting doing it again. And since that first time doing it, I've evolved in my relatedness to my dad and opened up looking for something different from him, like curiosity. And so this time what came to mind was all the stories he tells about his life. There's a theme around his impact in relationship and mentoring. And so I realized he was a plumber by trade and then went into facilities management. When he talks about it, he talks about those moments where he made an impact with his staff, or where he remembers a colleague and him joking when they were in early plumbing. And then now he talks about, he did some volunteer work with the church with teens. He still connects with a couple of the now men from those groups, and he went through cancer, and he talks about the stories of those moments where he would share human experiences with people. So I always thought, personally, I was always alienated from my family going into doing like soft skill coaching, and I'm a total nerd around human dynamics. But this moment I realized, wow, if my dad had had that as a freedom, like that he could explore, it just seems crazy to picture a different route for my dad. If you met him, that it just would be a completely different outcome for him. Yeah, that wouldn't have ever even been a possibility, but that's what comes out of his story. So that was really interesting to start noting. Yeah. So thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you for sharing that. I really it's always important for me to understand what happens with this experience. So many people have called their father and said, Dad, I never really asked you about the glint in your eye, and what was it? And then the dad says, oh, the glint in my eye was you guys raising you up. And then just going, no, Dad, tell me, when you were a kid, what was, what did you dream of doing? Was it playing baseball? Was it this, that? And just get yourself into that for a moment. And I'm not going to feel bad that I'm going to feel good that you cared so much about me that you gave up that glint. But I want to know about that part of you, that part that you did forfeit, because that's part of you. And so knowing that you pursued that, and that it was really helped you with your changed your relationship to some degree with your dad, and you saw different parts of him. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I was actually a lot less judgy.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't even know I had that relatedness to my dad. But I did. It was kind of not pleasant to view myself, but it really altered my appreciation for who he was over the last several years, and just deepened a relationship where I never thought that was even an option. So yeah, it had a big impact.
And that can then in turn affect your impact on the way you see your husband, the way you see your brother, the way you see other men in your life, and therefore ultimately the way you see yourself. You're half your father and half your mother genetically. And so,
it's helped me in relating to my co-parent with my daughters. Like it really had a trickle out effect of viewing the men in my life and seeing my own I socialized, I'll say, or in my own family kind of upbringing, whichever, a way of viewing men. It had me question that and open that up a lot more. So yeah,
Thank you, Beth. That's really beautiful.
yeah, yeah. Nice to see you again.
Very nice to see you again, too.
Yeah.
Anybody have any final questions or comments that you'd like to make? And I'll be happy to address a question or two that's even outside of the experience we just did. Okay, I'll end by just saying that, you know, if sometimes I think the most important thing is to understand solutions to things, and there's many, many levels of solutions. But if I were to ask you, because we don't have time to really delve into it now, to suggest where to go in the Boy Crisis book that will be that has been most useful to so many people solutions wise, one of the things is to look at the differences between dad style parenting and mom style parenting and what each contributes to the parenting process. Number two, look at the instructions for family dinner nights and how to create family dinner nights without having them become family dinner nightmares. Because in that process, you'll discover the whole how to apply the listening process to your family and learn a great deal about empathy. So empathy, for example, it's really helpful when a family goes around and asks for each child's and each parent's opinion and perspective. But oftentimes parents shut children up by giving negative body language when the child says they're doing something that's dangerous, or they're hanging out with somebody, and become advice givers before they really listen and empathize and allow themselves to articulate what they heard their son or daughter say. And so that can be very inhibiting to the daughter or son really opening up. But something else often happens at family dinner night, which is oftentimes very, very empathetic parents tend to be over-focused on the feelings that their children have, but if you're over-focused on the feelings your children have and don't require your children to also pay attention to the feelings and the fears that you have and the stories that you tell in your life experiences, you actually do harm to your children, because children that are the receivers of one-way empathy do not become empathetic children. They become self-centered children. So if you mention that to any teacher and ask the teacher to think about kids in her class who are empathetic, and then go to or who are very self-centered, and go to their memories of parent-teacher night, oftentimes the teachers will explain, oh yeah, I remember at parent-teacher night, I had this son or this young man or this young woman in the class who was either very self-centered or very empathetic. And then I met the parents, and I expected the parents to be empathetic like the children were, but the parents were really quite self-centered. And those self-centered parents required implicitly those children to be empathetic to what the parents were about. And conversely, the very empathetic children oftentimes had, the very self-centered children often had quite empathetic parents. And so oftentimes, so empathy is something that's complex. It's developed both by listening to the children, but also requiring that the children listen to their brothers, listen to their sisters, and listen to their parents as well. And sometimes very empathetic parents can only be focused on following the story of their children's needs, rather than requiring their children to also be sensitive to others as well.
Yeah, so thank you, Warren. This is wonderful, and I'm glad we had our listeners share and participate. We ran out of time. I could have shared my dad's story, but we didn't have time. So, but I do want to ask you a question, maybe put you in the spot a little bit here, which is, you pointed out the problems with single mother households and the children that don't have fathers, for a variety of reasons. So what might these single mothers do to deal with that? I think that's one of the things that
I'm really glad you asked that question. So first of all, let me make it really clear that probably there's no working group that works harder than single mothers. Secondly, that the majority of children raised by single moms are not part of the boy crisis. they do well, and some do very well, like Clinton and Obama, and George Washington. They all, and so that's number two. Number three, here I'm going to just go bang, bang, bang about some of the things that mothers can do, but all of these things are explained in much greater depth in the boy crisis. So number one, get your child, your son involved with the Cub Scouts. Get your son involved with Boy Scouts. Get your son involved with boys clubs. Get your son involved with a faith-based leader who takes time developing groups that are confidential of boys about your son's age, and that requires the boys or encourages the boys to share their feelings and their fears, and is absolutely confidential, and make sure you have a trust and a good, that you choose a minister, priest, imam, or rabbi that are very much that you tune into and say, there is a good person there who I want to be a role model for my son. Get your son involved in what I call the liberal arts of sports, meaning organized team sports, pickup team sports, which is a lost art recently. Pickup team sports are very important for helping your son feel creative and developing parameters like, do we play half quarter, full quarter, so on. And also sports that are that have the discipline like tennis or gymnastics, where you work predominantly on your own discipline, but as a result of the success of your discipline, you contribute to the team. There's a lot of other things like that, but as I said, they're all in the Boy Crisis book in much greater depth. But thank you so much for closing with that question about what a single mom can do.
Thank you. Thank you, Warren. You're a true fountain of knowledge, that lots of research, but lots of heart and empathy. And it's beautiful and delight to have you here with your knowledge and your research and your practical application, but also your tuning into and sharing empathy and heart. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. And thank you for, most important, for making this happen to begin with, Yossi. You've made a great contribution.
Thank you all.